Ну, давайте начнем сегодняшнюю встречу.
Okay, let's begin our
Good
Zoom
evening,
meeting
distinguished colleagues, Michael and Nicole. Good morning to you. I'm very happy to see all of you on this webinar. This is a third webinar. It is devoted to disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation is a false information. It's a concept known to all of us. And what is the difference between disinformation and misinformation? Today, in the era of rapid development of high information technologies and social networks, how has disinformation changed and what were the reasons for that? The third webinar speaker will tell us about this and other issues related to misinformation and disinformation. Nicole Cooke, you're welcome. Nicole, we're very happy to see you at this webinar. Distinguished colleagues, let me introduce Nicole. Nicole Cooke is the Endowed Chair of Augusta Baker, the University of South Carolina, Associate Professor in the School of Library and Information Sciences. Her research and teaching interests include human information behavior, consumption of and resistance to fake news, critical study of cultural information, and issues of diversity and social justice in librarianship. Nicole Cooke awards include the American Library Association's Equality Award in 2016 and the Library Diversity Research Award in 2017, and also the Illinois Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Award for her work against online hate speeches and discrimination in 2019. Also, in 2019, Nicole Cooke was awarded by the Association for Library Information Education for excellence in teaching. I would like to thank Nicole for taking the time to speak on the webinar for my colleagues. The specialist of national libraries, national public libraries, as well as specialists of libraries of schools, colleges, and higher educational institutions showed interest in this webinar and are here to take part in this webinar. Colleagues, let me remind you that this webinar is being implemented as a part of the Media Literacy for Librarians project. This project is being implemented with a grant from the American Corners program of the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Cultural and Educational Programs. Our partner is the American Library Association, and the members of these associations are the webinar speakers. We will be assisted by the head of the International Relations Department of the American Library Association, Mr. Michael Dowling, and he has invited and will invite the best speakers to our webinar. Michael, we're very happy to see you. I think our colleagues have already seen him. Please note that the webinar will be translated into Kazakh and Russian languages. We have professional translators, Asem Baydildinova and Anna Kabardina, with us. I hope that you have selected the desired translation language. Please check. To select the translation language, click on the globe symbol at the bottom right of the computer screen and select the translation language you wish. If you are using a mobile phone, click on the dots with the inscription additionally in the lower right corner of the display. Then click on translation in the window that opens and then select Kazakh Russian. If you have any questions, you can contact my coordinators of the webinar, Жанна Терекжановна Sakpanova and Maya Turdubekovna Suleimenova. You can see their phone numbers in the chat. If you have any questions to the speaker, write those questions in the chat box. Nicole will answer the questions after she finishes her presentation. We will try to save the recording of the webinar and publish it on the YouTube channel. The links will be sent to all the participants. And now, I have finished my introductory speech. I would like to give the floor to our speaker, Nicole Cooke. Nicole, the floor is yours.
Good day, colleagues. Good evening. Thank you for inviting me and thank you for that very kind introduction. And so today I want to talk to you a little bit about the urgency of media literacy. I know that this is your third webinar and you've talked about infrastructure and some other important topics, so hope to continue this conversation today. So the first couple of slides, I just wanted to give you some of the citations for some of the things that I have written about fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. And much of that information will be included in today's presentation. So today's presentation will mainly be about a book that I wrote for the American Library Association entitled Fake News and Alternative Facts, Information Literacy in a Post-Truth Era. So that came out in 2018. And like you all, I continually need to keep on top of misinformation and disinformation because we are just surrounded by it. It has become much more sophisticated, and we need to figure out how we can resist fake information and how we can help our communities also resist and push back on fake information and disinformation. So as you all know, information is just everywhere, and it can be really overwhelming, particularly with social media and all of the digital information that we consume on a regular basis. So as information professionals, we provide hubs for lifelong learning in our libraries and in our organizations. And we have always been resources for helping communities develop information and media literacy skills. Now, in an age when we are increasingly relying on digital media for information and communication, critical thinking skills are more important than ever. So as you can see from the screen, information is the water that we swim in. And as a type of information, we have misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, and I'll explain those in just a moment. But we swim in this information. We are so surrounded by information all the time. And so what begins to happen, particularly when we are faced with false information, it becomes normalized. So if we don't question the information that we are surrounded by, we encounter the normalization of untruths. And that is a phrase that was put forth by Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was the lead scientist in the United States during the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's talk a little bit about language as we move on. And so fake news is not a new phenomenon. There are records of fake news being used in print as early as the 1800s. But fake news has become very politicized, and it has really lost its meaning. So when we are talking about false information, instead of using fake news, we're using misinformation and disinformation, and also malinformation. So as you heard in the introduction, misinformation is really just false information. And it doesn't have to be malicious. It could just be false. It could be something as simple as a typo, or perhaps someone is given the wrong address or the wrong information, about anything, right? So there is no bad intention behind the information, but it is false. Most of what we see in the middle here is disinformation. Disinformation is also false information, but the difference here is the motivation behind the false information. Disinformation is deliberately created, and it's deliberately created to mislead or deceive. And it could be anything from rumors, it could be something about climate change or medical information. And this is information that could really cause harm if the person receiving the information doesn't know how to check or verify the information being given to them. The third type of misinformation is called malinformation. So M-A-L information. And think of the word malice or malicious. And so that implies ill intent. And so this is disinformation that is, again, purposely created to harm, right? But this is information that, particularly with COVID, the pandemic, and other types of health information, if people are given the wrong information, they could lose their health. We've had people die because they believed malinformation that was put across by people they trusted. So, for example, in the United States, there was a brief period when people were encouraged to take chlorine tablets and also take other types of chemicals and things in an effort to not contract COVID. Okay, so this is called the information disorder, right? And really, this is just giving you a spectrum of misinformation to malinformation. Now, I do want to go back. I managed to skip a slide. And just to further clarify why we should not be using the term fake news, and instead we should be using misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So fake news is really inadequate to capture the complex problem of disinformation. So I know you all know how complex this is, and it becomes even more complex when we are trying to teach others how to recognize and verify disinformation and misinformation. Fake news is also misleading because it has been appropriated by people who use the term to dismiss coverage that they find disagreeable. And I'll have examples of that a little later on. So there are many forms of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So I'm just going to give us a second, and I'm going to read through some of the things that I have here for the translators. And this is not a comprehensive list, but you can see that there are so many different types of disinformation that we need to be aware of. So we have fabrications, we have misinterpretations, we have misrepresentations, we have alternative facts, and then we just have plain old lies. right? People lie and they, just deliberately pass off false information. So this first grouping that I've just read to you could be considered types of lies, if you will, right? And they have some nuance in terms of perhaps why people are lying, but it all comes down to people passing on and creating false information. Then we have omission or suppression of information. So think of omission as a little white lie, something that I'm just not telling you, right? And so this becomes a problem if we suppress information that people actually need, right? So even an omission can create or can further disinformation. We have the flooding of information. We can call that information overload. And so when we get too much information, it becomes overwhelming and it becomes very easy to just turn off and dismiss the information that you're receiving. And sometimes that is the point of disinformation and malinformation, is to overwhelm so people won't question. We have deception, right? Similar to lies and misleading. We have hoaxes or spoofs. So hoaxes are elaborate jokes or tricks or games, but they have malintention, right? So if you have, I have examples of that later as well, but if you have a false situation that is presented as true, that could be considered a hoax. And we need to know how to discern when we are presented with information we need versus a hoax. There's also satire or humor. And in and of itself, those are not necessarily bad things. But if we don't know that it's satire, it could still very much be misinformation or disinformation. And we need to know how to discern satire as well. We have propaganda and yellow journalism. And this refers to misinformation and disinformation that comes through our media, whether it's online or whether it's radio or whether it's television. And so many people think that because they hear information from a trusted media outlet, that the information is true. And that's not always the case anymore. So essentially, we have to question everything at this point. We have a lack of context, and that's very similar to omission in the sense that if we are missing information or context, we can't get the whole story. So it's hard for us to tell what's true and what's false. Other forms of misinformation and disinformation include racism, xenophobia, and stereotypes. So this is specifically disinformation and malinformation about people who are different from us. We have lack of perspective or different perspectives. Everyone doesn't agree. We all have different viewpoints, and that very much impacts how we receive and interpret information. We have censorship when information is deliberately suppressed. That is a form of disinformation. And finally, for this list, we have rumors and conspiracies, right? Those are very elaborate stories, excuse me, meant to deceive and mislead. And we all know how quickly rumors spread. And so rumors can be salacious, they can be gossipy, they can be funny. And when we encounter that kind of information, it's very easy to pass on because it's a good story. And And finally, for this list, we have polarization and weaponization. When we have information that it can then be turned and used against us. So, for example, the phrase fake news has now been weaponized in the sense that it no longer means what it initially meant. It now means something else. So we have to be aware of how language changes and how terms and phrases change, particularly when it comes to politics, health, or any type of controversial topic. So this is an example of satire. And so this young man in Kazakhstan was running a website that provided satirical news. And in 2021, in May 2021, an investigation was launched and he faced criminal prosecution for spreading false information. And so they accused him of spreading false information, not realizing it was satire and not realizing that it was done in humor. So in the United States, we have a very similar website called The Onion. And The Onion has very realistic headlines. And they're a little far-fetched, but perhaps they're not as far-fetched now in 2023 as they were years ago. But it is satire. It is meant to be a joke. And so what has happened is that satire sites have now had to include disclaimers saying that this is a satire news site. This is not real news because, you know, with satire, there is always a realistic element or some type of kernel of truth that makes the news seem like it's actually possible, right? So we do have to be aware of satire and be able to talk to people about how to distinguish satire from information that they can trust. And just by the way, the investigation was dropped against this young man in September of 2021 after they discovered and discussed what satire really means. We have another example of propaganda, conflicting headlines, and just a lack of information. And so this was an example of a conflict, reporting of a shooting. And really what I wanted to point out is the difference in headlines. And so this article was talking about the different news outlets and the different headlines that they assign to different events. So if you have one outlet that has a particular bias, that very well may come out in their headlines and how they write the story, in the pictures that they display, how they display the pictures, etc. And then if you go to another outlet, you could have the same picture, but a completely different headline, and the story is written in a very different way. So part of what we need to be doing is consulting multiple sources for any event or any piece of information. And so another example here is a lack of information. So this event, and I believe it's Almaty, there was a lack of internet access. Apps like WhatsApp and Telegram were shut down. And so when you have things, apps and information that is removed or shut down for whatever reason, it's even harder to identify fake information because you literally don't have access. So that's another dilemma in terms of how we talk to people about disinformation and misinformation. All right. The next example, this is about COVID-19, the coronavirus. And I think that this is one of the most universal examples that we can talk about in terms of misinformation and disinformation, because it was indeed a worldwide pandemic, and we were all susceptible to this virus. When the virus first made the rounds in the news, there was a lot of confusion, and there was a lot of fake news. There was a lot of misinformation and disinformation because this was brand new and people didn't know what was happening. And so there was a lot of information overload, which I mentioned a little earlier, which is just an extreme amount of information coming at you very quickly. And you don't know what information to take in. You don't know what information to disregard. And also with something like the pandemic, we have very emotional responses to information. So something like COVID-19, there was a lot of fear involved. There was a lot of anxiety involved because you didn't know how the virus was being spread. Then in the middle of that, we all experience lockdown and isolation, right? So people get very anxious about the information, and we have these emotional responses. And when we become too emotional, it does indeed impact how we interpret and apply information. So that's a lot of the work that I do in terms of how people emotionally respond to information. So another example is if Michael tells me something that's really happy, or that makes me laugh, or that confirms something that I already know, emotionally speaking, I am more apt to accept what he says and believe what he says. On the other side, if he tells me something that makes me angry, or that makes me fearful, or that doesn't agree with what I already think I know, I may be more inclined to not believe him or to disregard the information he's sharing with me. So we do need to be aware of how we emotionally respond to information. So this is a quick example of how words are weaponized, phrases are weaponized and used in a polarizing fashion. So this is a Portuguese soccer player who was accused of a crime, and his response to the allegations were, "It's fake news." So he was using this phrase as a way to distract from the issues at hand, and also as a way to confuse. So distraction and obfuscation, hard word to say, but it's really confusion, are very common tactics with disinformation and misinformation. It comes down to, if there is enough information that is confusing, people may ignore it, or people may become overwhelmed with it and disregard it and not fact check the information. So distraction and confusion, very common tactics. Then, of course, as you all know, we have social media. And with misinformation and disinformation on social media, the analogy that is frequently used is, think about a fire hose, and the water that is coming out of a fire hose is all of the information that's coming at us very quickly and in a very in great magnitude. And so with social media, information is spread instantaneously, and you can't often take it back. So you can't correct anything. So that becomes even more of a challenge with disinformation. As you can see on the left-hand side, there are multiple reports and lots of research done about the impact of disinformation, particularly on social media, on youth. So we have youth around the world that are exposed to extremism, violence, and other things. On the right-hand side, we have a report from Science magazine that says fake news spreads faster than true news on Twitter and certainly other social media platforms. And not only is disinformation spread by people, of course, by sharing false information, but we also have bots, robots, technology. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So there are lots of different ways that disinformation is spread and spread very quickly. Another point about social media is the disinformation is so easily shared because it's just very simple to share. It's literally a click of a button. It's instant gratification, and it's people wanting to be part of a community. It's people wanting to be first with different news so they can say, I shared it first or I knew it first. And it's, you know, because it's so easy, people don't take the time to actually read the articles or vet the information that they're sharing. So a little bit more about technology and its role in information or misinformation and disinformation. And this is, you know, online via social media. We know that the online environment has bots, as I just mentioned. These are automated accounts, whether they are Twitter profiles or Facebook profiles or any type of entity that we encounter online that's really just automated. It's coded to respond to certain things. There are bots on Twitter that are coded to respond to certain words, and then the bot will automatically post disinformation. And so you're in this cycle of you post information, the bot gives you back some disinformation. Someone happens to believe that disinformation, it is then shared again, then the bot responds again. So we have to be, you know, very cognizant of bots and also algorithms. There's lots of research about algorithms and how social media platforms are feeding us information based on what they think they know about us or based on things that we've already seen or watched. And so as you can see on this particular graphic, we have a lot of hate speech in addition to disinformation. So I would even call that malinformation. Again, there's malice behind that disinformation being spread. Another dimension of the technology and its role in disinformation is moderation or the lack thereof. So Facebook, Twitter, other platforms, they actually have real people moderating the information that is placed on the platforms. So that can be a good thing most of the time. It could also be a bad thing. But the point of the moderation is if humans are doing it, we may be missing information, or there may be a rhyme or reason to the information that's being put forth. There could be something being left out because the moderator doesn't deem it to be important, right? So just, you know, being aware of the idea that there may always be information that's missing, or there may be something that's omitted or suppressed. There's also moderation that's done automatically by artificial intelligence, and that presents its own problems in terms of what information is released versus what information is withheld and or suppressed. So even yesterday in the United States, there was a news story. There is a lawsuit against YouTube, or several lawsuits against YouTube, and they are suing YouTube for their algorithm. So when you watch videos, and this happens on TikTok and Instagram and other places, when you click on a particular video to watch, the algorithm picks up on what they think you're watching, and then they make suggestions. And then if you click on the next video, it will further refine that algorithm and then make another suggestion. And so this is thought to be how people become radicalized, or they go down rabbit holes of conspiracy theories because they are following the breadcrumbs provided by the algorithm. So it's thought that this lawsuit won't go anywhere, but it is something I think to be aware of, because people think that it's innocuous to just click on the next video. But the algorithm that are coded by people can be problematic, and people need to be aware of what they're watching and how it leads to other things. So let's move a little bit more into media manipulation. And media manipulation is increasingly dangerous and hard to combat. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of media manipulation. And media manipulation is absolutely disinformation. It is purposely created to deceive and mislead. And this could be using technology to change audio, video, photos, print, etc. And so then when things are manipulated, then they are pushed out as disinformation and very rapidly shared and become quote unquote fake news. So this is a research report that I have on the screen by Data and Society, which is a research group here in the States that talks a lot about technology and information. And for deep fakes and cheap fakes, and I have examples of that coming up, they say by using lookalike stand-ins or relabeling footage of one event as another, media creators can easily manipulate an audience's interpretations. So deep fakes and cheap fakes are referring to videos and photos and how they can be manipulated. They also say that new media technologies do not inherently change how evidence works in society. What they do is provide new opportunities for the negotiation of expertise and therefore power. So in other words, the people creating the information are the ones that have the power, because they are the ones determining what people believe and what they accept. Now, you're not going to be able to see this very clearly. It needs to be enlarged, but this is one of the links that I will pass on so you can read this report if you care to and expand this graphic. Essentially, it's giving you a spectrum of deep fakes to what they call cheap fakes. So deep fakes are very skilled and they look like, the real thing, if you will. So one of the most popular deep fake examples is a video of former United States President Barack Obama. And there was he was being imitated by a popular filmmaker who was imitating his voice, his movements, etc. And the actor who was doing this did it purposely to say, with the right technology, I can make you think that I'm Barack Obama. And this is happening a lot, with people's faces being connected with words and phrases and arguments that they would never have themselves. So this is an issue not only of disinformation, but a context issue. So, for example, if people are not familiar with the person being used in a deep fake, they might not know it's fake because they don't know enough about that person or situation. Now, on the further end of this graphic with cheap fakes, these are manipulated photos or videos that are just so jokey, so poorly done, it's much easier to determine if they are fakes or not. So if you have filters on your apps, or if you have, just a very bad Photoshop job, it's easier to tell that these are fake images and misinformation. So just to walk you through a couple of examples. This is the Today Show. This is a morning show here in the States. And on the left-hand side, you have the original picture of the hosts. And then on the right-hand side, you have the same photo after it was photoshopped. So the first things you may mention, or may notice, is that the color of their clothing has changed. So instead of a maroon dress, the first woman now has a blue dress on. The second woman now also has a blue dress on. The gentleman with the glasses has a different colored shirt, right? So seemingly innocuous. When this type of work is done on a photo, it's used to quote unquote enhance a picture, right? Or make it better. So perhaps no malintent, no ill intent. Now, if you take this a little bit more seriously and think about all of the different ways that you can manipulate a photo with Photoshop, just as a couple of examples, they have enlarged the eyes of the folks in the picture. They have opened their eyes a little wider. Maybe someone had their eyes closed during the picture. They smoothed out skin. They brightened teeth or brightened eyes. Maybe they took the red eye out of the photo. But then you get a little bit deeper where they are creating a waist, maybe where there wasn't a waist before. They're smoothing out wrinkles on people, in addition to wrinkles on their clothing. They're slimming down their legs and arms and manipulating body parts. They're tweaking color, skin color, etc., changing hair color. So you can see where this might become a little bit more manipulative in terms of how people are being presented. Other examples of media manipulation when it comes to video. So on the left-hand side, this was a photo, obviously, of a news anchor who was reporting on a flood. What actually happened is that this picture was taken roughly 10 years before the current event. So news outlets, social media, they can use the wrong picture. And that is also manipulation of media. So for example, in this picture, the broadcaster is almost waist deep in water. And that could make you think that this storm was really, really serious. But if they're using this picture for another storm, that's disinformation because the current storm may not have been as severe. On the right-hand side, we have American politician Nancy Pelosi. And there was a particular video of her, and artificial intelligence was used to create a deep fake of her. And what was actually done is that the video was slowed down. And it was slowed down to the point where it appeared that her speech was slurred. And so the disinformation and malinformation that came out about that was that she was drunk, or that she was medically incapacitated. And that's why her words were slurred. So that's used as disinformation to detract from her stance as a politician, to detract and confuse the words that she's saying. Okay. So I won't show the video, but I will include the links. This is the deep fake of Barack Obama that I mentioned to you. And you can see that, you know, if you're familiar with him, it very much looks like him. And when you play the video, the actor impersonating sounds very much like him. And so if you're not familiar with him, you may not detect that this is a deep fake. All right, so an example of how sophisticated the technology has become. This is another video link I'll send. They're both on YouTube so that you should be able to get the transcripts so you can tell what's happening in the video. This is from the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation in the UK. This is a report that they were doing, and they said that social media manipulation campaigns are now targeting users with video content. So you see this a lot with political campaigns. If you have political ads or, you know, visuals or media that people are using to sway the audience to their side. And so that's becoming more common on any social media platform, that people, content creators, are putting together videos, blogs, tweets, profiles, etc., in the form of a campaign to make themselves more believable and or to get the audience to come over to their point of view. So it's good that we have more and more awareness of these things, and that these types of issues are coming up on in mainstream media, if you will, so people have more awareness of what's happening with misinformation and disinformation. So with all of these examples, this is why we desperately need media literacy. All right. And so with this last example, let me just read to you what the person said. And this is fighting disinformation in the age of COVID-19. So the person being interviewed says, everyone needs to understand the importance of media literacy, from children to pensioners. It has such a significant impact on our society. People need to be able to think critically and differentiate between fact and propaganda. Right now, sadly, many people fall for propaganda or believe fake news because they don't fact check the information or the source. A recurring example of the spread of disinformation during the pandemic is a story about airplanes dropping the virus over cities across Kazakhstan, causing a rise in the number of COVID-19 cases. What's worse, she says, is that media outlets were also sharing these stories because they're clickbait. All right, clickbait being very salacious, gossipy things that people want to hear more about. The stories spread like wildfire. People then tend to believe these stories because they are seeing them across platforms. All right, so you're seeing the same disinformation in different places. And so that is called repetition theory, when we see the same information over and over again. And the more times we see it, the more likely we are to believe that information, even if it's false. So this article goes on to discuss the urgent need for media literacy. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about. These next slides, these are getting into what I teach in class to students who work in information organizations, libraries, etc. And we talk a lot about what they need to know, but also what they need to know to work with their communities and helping them to distinguish between disinformation and information that they can trust. So again, we talk a lot about information and emotions and how we can really be dominated by our emotions when it comes to information we accept or not. So this is American comedian Stephen Colbert. And this was in October 2005. So quite a few years ago, before this current iteration of fake news. He was joking, right? He's satire, he's a satirist. He was talking about truthiness, which is another word for fake news. And his definition of truthiness is that we are trusting our gut when it comes to information and not trusting our heads. So he is saying essentially that we are emotionally responding to information as opposed to fact checking or vetting information in the way that we perhaps know we should, but just don't do because we choose to believe this information for whatever reason. So we talk about emotions and information. We also talk about political economy. And by political economy, what I mean is that a lot of disinformation and malinformation is purposely created for money. It becomes a business. And so there are fake news farms. And what that means is that there are people in an office space, in cubicles, that all they do is write false blog posts, or they create disinformation videos. They create those campaigns that were a couple of slides back. Because every time we click on something or view something, that creator is getting paid. And so there's a business behind a lot of this disinformation and misinformation. So we talk to students about how to use that as additional context, particularly when you're trying to vet a source. Who owns that piece of media? Who owns that newspaper? Who owns that channel? Who owns, whatever it is? Because when you dig deeper into who owns what, then you get a sense of their point of view, whether they, what their political leanings are, how they feel about certain topics. And that is very much how that fake news or disinformation is created. All right, so political economy is really the business of disinformation. We talk about what they call filter bubbles and echo chambers. And this is when information is very carefully curated. So you see this a lot on social media. So for example, I can curate my list of friends on Facebook and have it such that I don't see any information that disagrees with what I believe in. So again, that could be a good thing, right? Particularly if you find something stressful, or it could be, perhaps not such a good thing because you are purposely excluding other information that you might disagree with, or that might make you angry, etc. So there is a balance. But the point here is to recognize that we can create our own bubbles, and therefore we are missing information. Similarly, we could create our own echo chamber. And the echo chamber is along the same lines, is that we curate the information that we consume so carefully that we only hear what we want to hear. We only hear what confirms what we already know. So again, some folks do really well with echo chambers and filter bubbles, but it is something to be aware of. Then we have the psychology of misinformation and disinformation. All right, so not only is there emotional responses to misinformation and disinformation, there are psychological impacts of misinformation and disinformation. I think the easiest example is to think about people who are involved in cults or involved in a religion so deeply that they can't hear anything else. So if you read about cults, which I'm doing a lot of to really understand more of the psychology, the beliefs become so ingrained that people almost literally cannot hear anything else. And when you hear about people coming out of cults or leaving certain religions or leaving certain groups, they often talk about it as deprogramming, right? So there is a lot of psychological components to the information that we receive, particularly if we hear it over and over again, particularly if the information provides us with community, particularly if the information really validates our worldview, right? So it can become tricky to discern this particular part as well. So when we talk, after we talk about some of the larger issues and the larger context of disinformation, we start talking about some of the concrete things that we can do for ourselves and also for the communities that we work with. So this was a brief article that was based on my book that I mentioned to you earlier. And this is 7 things to know in the fight against fake news or misinformation, disinformation. Know the jargon, know the language, right? If we're identifying headlines, are the headlines really, are they really provocative? Are they really flowery and using, big words? Are they obviously slanted to one view or another? So knowing the words, knowing the language of disinformation. As I mentioned to you earlier, fake news isn't new. We're just in the current iteration, and we will probably in the next 10 years be in another iteration, but it's still the same phenomenon. Also mentioned earlier, sometimes there's a kernel of truth involved in the disinformation. So we need to be able to pick out what's true and then also, the false context that's around it. Again, repetition makes it hard, right? Because you hear something so many times, you hear it in so many different places that you tend to believe that it's true. Skepticism is healthy. We should be questioning the information that we're receiving. And as you all know, particularly because of technology and social media, disinformation has gotten harder to spot and harder to discern. And then lastly, we need to know what we can do about it. What strategies and techniques can we use to help ourselves and others with disinformation? I wanted to share with you the 5 key principles of misinformation. And this is put forth by Dr. Joan Donovan. And she's one of the leading researchers in the US on misinformation. And she's based at Harvard University. She says that information is fast and cheap. And then she says that knowledge is slow and expensive. And she uses this, this analogy to say that misinformation and disinformation are fast and cheap. It moves really quickly. There's an overabundance of it. You're always surrounded by it. But when we take the time to fact check and to vet our sources and to examine information in the larger environment, that's a slower process. And that is a more expensive process in terms of time and resources. And so her argument is that we need to be working more towards knowledge instead of information, right? So we need to be moving away from disinformation back to fact checking, vetting our information, and locating sources for quality information. She says that search and social media circumvent social institutions by conflating or mixing up information and knowledge, right? So a lot of people think that they get knowledge from social media, when in fact they are getting information that may or may not be true. She says everything open will be exploited for fun, politics, or profit. All right. So again, knowing the context for why some disinformation is created. She says in an active crisis, for example, a weather event or COVID-19, there is no real-time knowledge, only real-time information. And so that's why every time there is some type of crisis, there is an influx of misinformation and disinformation, because people are just throwing things out instead of trying to create knowledge from what's happening and then disseminating that knowledge. So I have another example, another model to share with you. And this is the critical cultural literacy model. And this is just meant to emphasize that we need to be examining information in context. A lot of misinformation and disinformation are consumed in isolation, right? We just take the information in and we move on. It's a very solitary activity. But what we need to be doing is working collectively and also working in context. So if there's a piece of information, is there history behind the information that you need to know? Are there political implications that you need to be aware of? Are there particular emotions that this information is meant to kind of manipulate? Are there images and photos that are being manipulated? Are there cultural norms that are being implied in that information? Similarly, are there stereotypes involved in this information? So again, instead of looking at things in isolation, we need to, it's almost like peeling an onion back. What are the different layers? What is the different context that we need to know of with any given piece of information? Now, these next couple of slides, this is more concrete information, if you will. When I was an academic librarian almost 20 years ago, this is how I was teaching students how to evaluate websites, right? So this is when the internet was a little bit newer, and there just wasn't the flood of information. This was pre-social media. But we were telling students, and I find myself still telling students this same information. Click on the headline, right? Don't just share something. Open it, see what it is. Checking the source. What is the source of this information? Is there an about page, right? Who is putting this information forth? Just because it looks valid doesn't mean that it is. Similarly, is the language inflammatory? Or do you feel like there's any bias at all with the language being used? Is it well written? That is sometimes an obvious clue that we miss, because there is so much content online that is poorly written. Does the site have a lot of ads, right? Is there an author? A lot of the content that we see has no author listed. Are there supporting sources? So otherwise, or other words, are there citations? Check the date. The information could be valid or not, but if it's used out of context, it is still disinformation. So think about that picture that I showed you of the reporter in the storm. Valid picture, but used a decade later to mislead about another current story. We also talk about triangulating, verifying, and fact checking. All right, so I've mentioned verifying information, also fact checking information, and that for us as information professionals, that's really just doing our due diligence and researching a particular piece of information as best we can. The one that I want to point out is triangulation. Are you seeing this information in at least 3 places? Now, this becomes tricky when we are encountering those social media campaigns where, the same information is across multiple platforms. But there is still a lot of disinformation that you will only see in one place. Now, you'll see it across, like, for instance, Twitter. You'll see the same tweet over and over because people are sharing it. But are you seeing this information in the newspaper? Did you hear it on the radio? Are you hearing it in other places? So chances are, if you're not hearing it in other places, it's likely misinformation. Vertical and lateral reading really just refers to checking the sources and backing up what you're reading. So for example, if you are reading a newspaper article and they say, Michael said this, go back and read the piece where Michael said, or where that quote was pulled from, right? So you're checking your sources essentially, and you're reading across, and you're trying to identify this information in different places. We also talk about checking our own biases. All right, so think about, the role of emotion or, whatever your political beliefs are, et cetera. It really does color how we interpret information. And so this is not to chastise biases in that way. It's just meant to make people aware of how they are personally filtering information. Read outside your bubble, even if it makes you mad. What are because there's other information that you might need to know. And this is what we've been talking about in our time together today, knowing the difference between satire, propaganda, infotainment, which is just entertainment news, opinion, right? There's a huge difference between fact and opinion. And also dog whistling. Dog whistling is when you're trying to antagonize people that are reading the information. Okay, so we need to know the differences between all of these types of information and disinformation. So for us as information professionals, I encourage us to think broadly and across disciplines. So for example, when I do research about misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, I'm looking at psychology. I'm looking at cognitive science. I'm looking at sociology. I'm looking at media studies, right? A lot of people are talking about disinformation. They may be using different terms for it, but they're talking about the same phenomenon. And we need to know what they're talking about. For us as information professionals, transferable skills. A lot of us were perhaps trained in information literacy, and we do, classes for community members or students. Those are the same skills we need for media literacy, for computer literacy, like any type of literacy. This is all the same skill set. And it's really just critical thinking and questioning what you see, what you hear, and what you read. And so when we think about multiple literacies together, that is a term called meta literacy. And there are a couple of really good books about meta literacy and just thinking about literacy skills holistically. Okay. We need to be, again, thinking about how fake news and disinformation are created. And ultimately, we're working with our students to think, and we're teaching them how to think as opposed to what to think. All right, so last couple of slides, just call to action for us as information professionals, and final thoughts and further reading if you care to do so. So we know that misinformation and disinformation is endemic and expanding. I don't know that we were ever at a point where we could ignore it, but we certainly can't ignore it now. It's good at provoking outrage, right? Again, that emotional response. It lacks context and is still hindered by good intentions. And by that, I mean, not all misinformation is malicious, but we still need to identify it as false, right? We still have people sharing false information because they don't know it's false information. So again, there's no malice intended, but it is still indeed false information. So we need advocates who are empathetic, who are curious and want to do, that deep digging for fact checking and vetting. We need folks who are proactive. We need folks who are intellectually and culturally humble, which just means that we know that we don't know everything and there's always something else that we can learn. And we need to be working for the benefit of everyone when we're trying to debunk disinformation. All right, so we need to continue seeking action and clarity, right? So in other words, we need to be proactive in our work with disinformation. Like, we shouldn't be reactive. We shouldn't wait until there's a new crisis and another wave of disinformation to say, oh, we should have a class, or, we should be working with people about disinformation. This is ongoing. This is what we should be proactive with. So the next time a crisis comes, our patrons and our students already know how to do this and know how to do some of these skills for themselves. All right, and that includes being flexible, also an active listener. And also, don't forget, so again, this is a little bit of repetition theory. Everything has a context. Nothing happens in isolation. And if we forget that or ignore it, this will actually perpetuate the disinformation. We need to actively disrupt the normalization of untruths. And we shouldn't shy away from partnerships or theory. And we need all the tools at our disposal. So I can include these on a list for you. If we can get translated copies, I think that they are useful tools and useful reading as we continue this work. One, as you've seen before, is the report that I wrote for ALA about fake news and alternative facts. There is another great book entitled Teaching Media Literacy. There is another book. This is a little bit more theoretical as opposed to pedagogical, and they refer to it as truth decay. And by truth decay, they mean that increasingly we have disagreements about facts, and that things that we used to believe were true, we no longer believe are true. And that's really because of the abundance, the overabundance of information and the lack of media literacy skills to kind of cut through all of that information. They also say that it's a blurring of the line between opinion and fact, right? So for example, on our media channels, There are content creators, but there are fewer journalists, right? So we have people who are trained to deliver information, and that's very different than people who are just creating content for profit. Okay. We are also talking about, and we've mentioned this before, the increasing relative volume of opinion over fact. And we have declining trust in our sources. So that's probably another conversation in terms of what people trust. Do people trust mainstream media, or do they trust news and information that's coming to them more locally? The research shows that people trust information that is more local to them and their immediate environment. So won't go through these, but there are just lots of books, and there's so much to learn, whether you're reading about the algorithms, whether you're reading about how things are moving so fast, how people are using numbers and statistics to kind of twist an argument and promote disinformation. And so just lots of things that you can use as tools. They'll give you various websites that you can check information with. And so these are resources that are good for us as well as our community members. All right, lastly, I just wanted to show you there is a class here in the States at the University of Iowa, and they're talking about fake news, facts, information, disinformation, specifically in Kazakhstan, and they're using fiction and they're using literature to talk about propaganda, myths, how to debunk disinformation, how to fact check, and what to do when you encounter disinformation. That is really very specific. So just to say that we are all having these conversations in different ways and in different places. All right, so finally, just to urge people and challenge people to remain open to different perspectives when we're doing this work. Because in order to deal with disinformation, we're going to have to encounter information that we don't like, that doesn't comply with what we already know, but it is necessary if we're going to look at information in a holistic context. All right, so this picture is, someone likes the rain, someone dislikes the rain. But in order to combat misinformation, we have to see things from different perspectives. All right, last example, and I thought that this was probably my favorite example when I was doing some research on disinformation in Kazakhstan. And someone can tell me whether if they saw this or how this played out, that a newsreader quit after a fake interview. And so there was a fake interview conducted with a public figure, and it turned out that it was just fake, and it was, I don't know if it was quite satire, I think it was more malicious than that, but it did make the mainstream news. And so the anchor or the newsreader was presented with this interview and presented it as, this is news. And when they found out that this was indeed disinformation, they took a stand and they quit. And they said, this is not what I want to be a part of. So this is not necessarily a common reaction, but I thought it was really interesting. And it emphasizes how pervasive disinformation is. All right, so I am done. Just want to give you one last quote. It is our collective responsibility not to shrug our shoulders and sink to tacit acceptance of the normalization of untruths, because if we do, lies become dominant and reality becomes distorted. So thank you for your time today. I've been very pleased to spend some time with you all talking about disinformation, which is, I think, so important to all of us. And I will send a link with some of these books if people would like them. And I think we have time for questions now.
Құрметті Николь ханым, сізге осындай қажеттілігі
Thank you very
зор
much, and Nicole, for such an urgent issue, for telling about it in such a deep way. In fact, I think disinformation is a very it's a very large topic. It's of course we are not able to tell about all the angles. Of course, disinformation may be different in different formats, in the form of photo, video, or just a text. And it's very important to know why it has been created. And I think Nicole was able to tell about this, but I don't think we can learn how to distinguish between disinformation and truth. I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible. And I think that we need more webinars on this topic in order to understand more deeply this topic. That is why, in order to discern between false information, disinformation, and true information, we have to learn more from books, from websites, from different resources, so that we could learn that. And we have to update our knowledge all the time, because the time is changing, technologies are developing, new platforms are being created, and of course, technologies and high tech, they have both. They can be used for good things and bad things. And sometimes disinformation creators also use high tech. And I think that several webinars could be organized for that. I'm telling about this because there were some questions in the chat box about how to discern Photoshop, how we can know if it is Photoshop or not. That's why I'm saying that it's not something you can learn from one webinar, and a separate webinar is needed. As for the question, could you tell about your practice in teaching disinformation and misinformation? You have told about it, I know, but could you tell which are the most effective methods of identifying disinformation, which you could teach users or your students?
Yes, so the question about Photoshop, there are various tools where you can upload the picture. So it's not necessarily you picking out all the Photoshop elements, but knowing what tool to use that can then analyze the video or the media in question. In terms of the classes, I think tools are also a large part of this particular fight, in terms of teaching the students what resources are reputable, which ones are not, and how to tell what's reputable and what's not. For example, I give them different media outlets, and they have to go to that website or to, that source and find out who the owner is, find out what they cover, find out if there's a particular slant. So for example, there is a news magazine here called Newsweek. And Newsweek used to be a very reputable source. but they have changed ownership and they are no longer the reputable source that they once were. So there are a lot of people that are still posting Newsweek articles thinking that they are reputable, and we have to go back and say they're not anymore, and this is why. So I think a lot of this is hands-on and looking at different sources, evaluating them over time, and thinking about what tools we can use to, identify deep fakes or identify, Photoshop, et cetera. And then, like I mentioned in class, we spend a lot of time thinking about the larger context so people know what questions to ask when they're confronted with different pieces of information.
Рахмет, Николь ханым.
Thank you very much. So you have told about discerning, teaching how to discern information. So you focus more on practice, yeah, when you teach discerning disinformation from true information. The next question, what could you say about gender disinformation? What are the mostly spread topics and situations related to gender disinformation? What could you say about it?
Yeah, so one of the examples I give to students is something called the pink tax. And so you'll have, and this goes back to advertising, marketing, et cetera. When you see different products, it's the same product, but for men, it may be blue in color, right? Very stereotypical colors. For women, it could be pink. Sometimes, depending on what the product is cheaper for men than it is for women, right? So think in particular about perhaps hygiene products. Same product, but if it's marketed for women, it has different words attached to it, flowers and smelling nice and whatever they think will appeal. And it's packaged in pink, right? It's the same product. So that's some gender misinformation in terms of this idea that people require, different things. We get into a lot of huge amounts of disinformation when it comes to the LGBTQ community. And that really relies on stereotypes and xenophobia and really just fear of people and cultures that are different. So there's that's a whole category in and of itself, which is gender disinformation.
Рахмет. Келесі сұрақ.
Thank you very much. The next question. Are there any platforms which are devoted to protecting children from disinformation and media manipulation or information manipulation?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind immediately is called MediaWise. And they are specifically devoted to reviewing and vetting and evaluating media. And it's for parents or caregivers, I should say, and their children. You have places like Sesame Street and also other children's programs that are starting to talk about these issues. So they're doing it in a perhaps more indirect way. There are other organizations like the News Literacy Project, the Media Literacy Project, and they deal a lot with K-12 or elementary, secondary students and how to address media literacy with students. So they provide a lot of lesson plans. They provide opportunities for older secondary students to really learn how to fact check. And sometimes you'll see on their websites that the students are actually doing videos, which is really neat to see. That, one of the students will say, and this is what today's headline was, and let me tell you what's, true and what's false about this particular topic. So they're doing videos that are based on what they've learned and then the research that they were able to apply to disinformation.
Рахмет. Келесі сұрақ.
Thank you very much. The next question. What kind of difficulties you can encounter in teaching adults? What kind of recommendations you could give to the librarian when they will prepare this topic for their own community?
Yes. So, I mean, for me, I teach younger adults. So university age, late teens, early 20s. So we're talking about perhaps millennials or, whatever we want to call them. But they were in their lifetime, they've never not had the internet. They've never not had cell phones, et cetera. And so they have a different relationship with information and with media. So sometimes it's harder to get them to understand how pervasive disinformation is and why it's so important to fact check. So with the younger students, younger adults, there's, I think, a lot more hands-on because they're not as interested in the theory of it all. I think another significant population are our older adults who are not as used to cell phones, computers, laptops, et cetera, and thinking about information that is more relevant to them. And I think relevancy is really a key for any population. What are your examples? I think the techniques are relatively the same in terms of how you might teach and talk about these topics, but I think it's the examples that you use and the situations that you describe, what's most relevant to these groups. And that's how you kind of shift the teaching from one group to another.
Рахмет.
Thank you very much. 3 days ago, UNESCO organized a protest, which was called to show how depressing can be internet if we continue to ignore hate speeches, disinformation, censorship, conspiracy theories, violence in internet. This protest was aimed at creating internet working for the benefit of the society.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say about that? How would you comment this protest of the UNESCO?
I think it's absolutely necessary. It's imperative. The examples that you mentioned, hate speech and propaganda and things, again, this is what we can think of as malinformation. And malinformation can be so serious as people can lose their lives, their freedom, their liberty, et cetera. So I'm glad they're protesting, and I hope that their protests makes a difference because we have to be more vigilant about the information being created and the information being consumed.
Рахмет. И соңғы сұрақ.
Thank you very much. The last question. In your opinion, maybe this question is relevant to you. Do you think that our society could counteract disinformation and misinformation? Do you think we are ready? Because most of the people think that it's not their problem.
Mm.
Do you think we are ready?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great way to put it. And I agree with you that a lot of people don't care and they don't think it's their problem. With that said, I think that this is where libraries and information professionals can really play a significant role. I'm not saying it's easy to do, and I'm not saying that it's easy to get people's attention and easy to get them to change their minds and really think about why they need to have these skills. But I do think we're ready. I think that it is difficult because, as we've talked about, it's something we have to keep up with all the time. So it becomes difficult to keep on top of things. So I think we're ready to have basic conversations, and I hope that we have been having basic conversations. But we all have so many things to do, and keeping up with disinformation can be a full-time job, right? So then that's where it becomes difficult, and perhaps where we're not as ready as we could be.
Рахмет, мына жерде бір ағылшынша жазыпты.
Thank you very much. There is a question in the chat box in English.
Sites, what's your power?
Yes. So if I'm looking at the right question, many fake channels are getting verification on social media sites. Yes, that is a huge problem. And the one that comes to mind immediately is, now that Elon Musk has purchased Twitter, the verification does not mean what it used to mean. So we can't take verification. I don't know that we could take verification on social media 100%, at its face anyway, but certainly not now. So I think that would be more of us fact checking and verifying offline, right? So we can't take the information at face value. So yeah, I mean, the one thing about Twitter in particular, where Elon Musk stands, and what his viewpoints are and his biases, etc. So in that sense, it gives us more understanding of the information coming through. But it also tells us that we have to do even more of our own fact checking and verifying. Because again, the verification is being weaponized, right? As we talked about earlier. And it doesn't mean what it used to mean.
Рахмет, Николь ханым.
Thank you very much. I think the questions are over. I think we have read all the questions. If there are any additional questions, we will send them to you, distinguished colleagues. The recording of the webinar will be published. We will send you the link, and in Instagram, please follow the Instagram account. All the news will be available there. I would like to ask you, Nicole, to send your slides. Do you think we could send your slides to the participants? Do you agree that if we share them with the participants?
Yes, I just asked that they not be posted anywhere. Yeah.
Бұны сұрағаным, және
I've asked that. At the beginning of your presentation, you have told about Timirlan and Sibek, about Kazakh newsreader, and also you have given some information related to the Kazakh context. That's why I thought that this information could be used. And if we look at this information more deeply, I think it's good for better understanding of this information and misinformation during the January event last year, and at the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, it was quite horrible. Situation was quite horrible. And when the internet was off, the fear was almost everywhere. The importance of misinformation and disinformation cannot be overestimated. And I think we've understood during those critical periods how urgent these topics are. So distinguished colleagues, Nicole has agreed to share with you, but it must not be published. I hope that you've understood this. I would like to thank all of you for taking time and participating in this webinar. We have over 300 participants here. When I've looked at the first webinar and second webinar participants, there were always over 200, 300 participants. Sometimes internet connection is not very good at the remote places, at the remote villages. If you are not able to see the whole of this webinar, you can see the recording. I hope that there will be more viewers of this webinar. I would like to thank the interpreters, Asiem and Anna. You've done a great job. I would like to say that our webinar is over. Thank you very much, Nicole, again. I hope you every success in your work. You have covered a very important issue. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
So I hope that you will learn more about discerning misinformation, disinformation from truth. Thank you very much. Be safe. Goodbye.